The morning sun rose over the fields of Kepler 442b, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Earth never knew. Daniel Grant stood at the edge of his farm, watching the crops sway in the gentle breeze, thinking about how 15 years had passed since the first colonists landed on this world. His daughter, Sophie, ran through the rows of modified wheat, her laughter carrying across the fields like music. She had been born here 8 years ago, making her one of the first true children of this colony. And Daniel often wondered what Earth would look like through her eyes if she ever visited the homeworld. The settlement stretched across the valley below. 200 souls who had chosen to leave everything behind for a chance at a new beginning. Simple houses dotted the landscape, connected by dirt roads that Greg Patterson kept promising to pave someday. And the community center stood at the heart of it all. A symbol of their shared purpose. Sophie ran up to her father, her dark hair tangled with bits of wheat chaff, asking if she could go to morning lessons early today. Lisa Murphy had promised to show the children how to identify the native plants that grew near the forest edge. And Sophie never wanted to miss anything the teacher offered. Daniel smiled and nodded, watching his daughter sprint toward the community center where other children were already gathering. He recognized Kyle Barnes and Mia Rodriguez chasing each other around the building, while Jake Coleman sat on the steps reading something on his tablet. The colony had found its rhythm over the years, a peaceful existence built on hard work and cooperation. Claire Nelson ran the medical clinic. Greg kept the power systems running, and everyone contributed to the farms that fed them all, creating something that felt like home. Despite being light years from Earth, Daniel returned to his fields, checking the irrigation systems that Greg had designed to work with the planet's unusual water cycle. The work was hard, but satisfying, and he had just begun inspecting the eastern section when his communicator buzzed with an alert. The message came from Greg, his voice tight with concern, saying that something had appeared in orbit and asking Daniel to come to the operations center immediately. Daniel felt his stomach tighten as he ran toward the center, knowing that unannounced visitors were never good news. The operations center hummed with activity when Daniel arrived, with Greg pointing at the display screen showing a massive vessel hovering above the planet. The ship was unlike anything in their database, angular and aggressive in design, and it was broadcasting on all frequencies, demanding to speak with whoever led the human settlement. Daniel authorized the communication link, and the screen filled with the image of a creature that made his breath catch. 4 arms, reptilian features, scales that shimmered like metal, and eyes that showed no warmth or kindness whatsoever. The alien introduced himself as Commander Dexval of the Zenthari Enforcement Fleet, speaking in flawless English that somehow made his words more threatening. He stated that this planet belonged to the Vorkan species under galactic law, and that the human presence here was considered an illegal occupation. Daniel explained that the colony had filed proper settlement claims with Earth authorities before arriving, that the planet showed no signs of previous habitation, and that they had every right to be here. Dexval dismissed these arguments with a wave of one clawed hand, saying that Earth's claims meant nothing to the galactic community. The Zenthari commander delivered his ultimatum with cold precision. The humans had 48 hours to gather their belongings and evacuate, or his forces would remove them by whatever means necessary. Daniel tried to argue, tried to appeal to reason, but Dexval cut the transmission without another word. Greg stared at the blank screen, asking what they were going to do. Daniel looked around at the settlement visible through the window, at the homes and farms they had built with their own hands, at the school where his daughter was learning about native plants, and felt rage building in his chest. He called an emergency meeting in the community center, and within an hour every adult in the colony had gathered. Lisa stood near the front with her arms crossed. Claire looked worried but determined, and Greg was already calculating how much they could salvage if forced to leave. Daniel laid out the situation plainly. explaining what the Centauri demanded and what it would mean for their community. Sophie and the other children sat quietly in the corner, listening to every word with wide eyes. The vote was almost unanimous. They would stay and defend their home, contacting Earth for support, but not waiting helplessly for rescue that might never come. These colonists had not traveled across the galaxy just to surrender at the first sign of trouble. The Centauri landing craft descended that afternoon, carrying armed soldiers who began patrolling the settlement without permission. Daniel watched from his porch as these 4 armed aliens walked through the streets, their weapons visible and their attitudes making it clear they viewed humans as beneath. Their consynthecs established a command post near the community center, cutting power to non-essential buildings and restricting colonist movement. The soldiers spoke to humans with contempt, treating them like children who needed to be managed rather than people with legitimate rights. Sophie came home that evening, upset because a Centauri soldier had laughed at her when she asked why they were there. Daniel held his daughter close, promising that everything would work out. Even as he wondered how to keep that promise, that night he stood guard with Greg and others, watching the alien soldiers patrol under the unfamiliar stars. The Centauri moved with confidence, clearly believing the humans posed no threat. Clearly viewing this as a simple eviction rather than a confrontation, Daniel thought about his daughter, about all the children who called this place home, about the lives they have built in the soil of this distant world. He thought about the weapons the Centauri carried so casually, about the contempt in their voices, about the assumption that humans would simply comply. He had served in Earth's military before becoming a farmer, had seen combat and understood what war truly meant. He hoped it would not come to that, but watching the Centauri swagger through his colony, he felt something cold and hard settling into his mind. The honey badger was not the largest predator on Earth, not the strongest or fastest, but it was known for one thing above all others. When threatened, when cornered, when defending what mattered most, it never backed down, never surrendered, never stopped fighting. Daniel looked at the Centauri patrol passing below his window and allowed himself a grim smile. These aliens had no idea what they were dealing with, no understanding of what humans became when their children were threatened. The 48 hours had begun counting down. But Daniel knew the real countdown had started the moment those alien ships appeared in orbit. The only question now was whether the Centauri would learn their lesson through negotiation or through harder means. He returned inside where Sophie slept peacefully, unaware of the storm gathering around her home. Daniel kissed her forehead gently, making a silent promise that she would wake up in her own bed, in her own home, on her own world, no matter what it took to make that happen. Morning arrived with tension thick enough to cut, and Daniel gathered the colony leadership in his kitchen while Sophie ate breakfast at the table. Greg had spent the night analyzing the Centauri ship's capabilities, and the news was not encouraging. The alien vessel carried enough firepower to level the entire settlement from orbit, and the soldiers on the ground wore armor that could deflect most conventional weapons. Lisa asked the obvious question: how can a farming colony possibly resist a military force like that? Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching his daughter finish her cereal, and said something that made everyone stop. The Centauri had superior technology and firepower, yes, but they had made assumptions about humans based on incomplete information. And assumptions were weaknesses waiting to be exploited. He had sent a message to Earth through the emergency channel, but the response would take weeks to arrive given the distance. The colony could not wait that long, could not afford to show weakness while hoping for rescue from across the galaxy. Claire pointed out that they had families to protect, children who could be hurt if violence erupted. Daniel agreed completely, which was exactly why they needed to make the Centauri understand that threatening those children would be the worst mistake they could possibly make. Greg asked what Daniel had in mind, and the former soldier smiled in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. He reminded them that this colony had not been established by dreamers and idealists alone, that many of the original settlers had military backgrounds, that the farming equipment in their warehouses could serve multiple purposes if needed. Lisa objected, saying that turning farming tools into weapons seemed desperate. Daniel replied that desperation was what you felt when you had no options. But what he felt was determination to protect what they had built. The meeting ended with a plan, and each leader returned to their section of the colony with instructions. Greg would modify the security systems. Claire would prepare the medical facility for potential casualties, and Lisa would begin organizing the children's safety protocols. Daniel walked to the community center where Lisa taught her morning class, standing outside the window to watch Sophie and her friends learn. The children laughed and raised their hands eagerly, completely unaware of the danger surrounding them, trusting the adults to keep them safe. As Centauri patrol passed by, and one of the soldiers noticed Daniel watching. The alien made a dismissive gesture with two of his forearms, clearly amused by the human's concern. Clearly confident that these primitives posed no threat, Daniel met the soldier's eyes and held the gaze until the alien looked away first. That small victory meant nothing in the grand scheme, but it reminded Daniel that intimidation worked both ways inside the community center. Dexvol had established his command post, filling the main hall with alien equipment and soldiers. He called Daniel in for a meeting that afternoon, and the human leader found the Centauri commander reviewing data on a holographic display. The commander barely looked up when Daniel entered, treating the meeting like a formality rather than a negotiation. He stated that the evacuation deadline was still in effect, that transport ships would arrive in 36 hours to remove the humans, and that resistance would be met with appropriate force. Daniel asked what gave the Centauri the right to claim this planet for the Vorquin. Dexvol finally turned to face him, all four arms crossed in a gesture that suggested impatience. The commander explained that galactic law had been established millions of years before Earth even developed space travel, that the Vorquin had filed territorial claims on thousands of worlds, including this one, and that human ignorance of these laws was not an acceptable excuse. Daniel pointed out that the planet had been completely empty when they arrived. Dexvol replied that it did not matter, that the Vorquin planned to use this world eventually. That human settlement here was like squatters moving into someone's future home. The conversation went nowhere, with each side rejecting the other's arguments. Daniel left the meeting knowing that words would not resolve this situation, that the Centauri viewed humans as insignificant obstacles to be removed with minimal effort. He found Greg in the operations center, working on something he called insurance. The engineer had discovered that the Centauri relied heavily on their communication network, and he believed he could disrupt it if necessary. That evening, as the alien sun set and the colony lights came on, Daniel stood on his porch watching the Centauri soldiers patrol. They moved with casual arrogance, weapons held loosely, clearly bored by guard duty among beings they considered harmless. Sophie came outside to join him, asking why the aliens were being so mean. Daniel knelt down to his daughter's level, explaining that sometimes people with power thought that made them right, but strength without wisdom was just bullying. She asked if they were going to leave their home. Daniel promised they would not, that this was her world as much as anyone's. That being born here gave her more right to this place than any alien law could take away. The next morning brought the incident that changed everything. Lisa had organized a project for the older children to check on the greenhouse at the edge of the settlement, where they had planted earth vegetables as a science experiment. Sophie, Kyle, Mia, and Jake asked permission to go early, wanting to water the plants before the day got too hot. Lisa agreed, reminding them to stay together and return before the noon curfew that Dexvol had imposed. The four children walked through the settlement, passing Centauri patrols without incident. They reached the greenhouse and began their work. carefully tending to tomato plants and checking soil moisture levels. What they did not know was that HFY had declared the greenhouse area off-limits that morning, expanding the restricted zones without bothering to inform the colonists. When his Centauri patrol found the children inside, Sergeant Vex assumed they were deliberately violating his commander's orders. Daniel was in the operations center with Greg when the security cameras caught the confrontation. He watched in horror as 4 Centauri soldiers surrounded the children. Their weapons drawn, Vexter aimed his plasma rifle directly at Sophie, the weapon's targeting laser painting a red dot on her chest. He demanded the children come with him for processing and relocation. His voice harsh through the external speakers. Kyle tried to explain they were just watering plants, but the sergeant did not care. Mia started crying, and Jake put himself between the soldiers and the younger children in a brave but futile gesture. Daniel felt something break inside him, a wall that had been holding back the rage and fear of the past 2 days. He grabbed his communicator and called every colonist within running distance, telling them to get to the greenhouse immediately. Greg tried to say something about being careful, about not escalating the situation, but Daniel was already moving. He burst through the operations center door and sprinted toward the greenhouse. His mind focused on a single thought. They pointed weapons at his daughter, at children under his protection, at innocent kids who were just trying to take care of some plants. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences followed, the Centauri had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He reached the greenhouse with 5 other colonists right behind him, and saw the scene exactly as the cameras had shown. Sophie stood frozen with a weapon aimed at her heart, tears streaming down her face. While the Centauri sergeant demanded compliance, Daniel walked forward slowly, his hands visible and empty, his voice calm despite the fury burning through every nerve. He asked Vexter to lower the weapon, to let the children go, to handle this like civilized beings. The sergeant laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. He said that humans needed to learn their place in the galactic order, that pointing weapons at their young was simply enforcing discipline, that Daniel should be grateful they were showing such restraint. Daniel stopped walking, standing 10 feet from the alien who threatened his daughter. He spoke quietly, clearly, with absolute certainty. You just made the worst mistake of your life. Sergeant Vexter kept his plasma rifle aimed at Sophie, while his 3 soldiers covered the other colonists. He told Daniel that threats from a primitive species meant nothing, that the humans would surrender now or watch their young suffer the consequences. Daniel glanced at Greg, who stood slightly behind him with his hand near his communicator. The engineer gave the smallest nod, confirming that everything was ready, that the systems were in place. The former soldier looked back at the Centauri sergeant and said something that made Vexter hesitate. He explained that every species in the galaxy probably loved their children, protected their young, would die to keep them safe. Vexter lowered his weapon slightly, clearly confused by this sudden shift to philosophy. Daniel continued speaking, his voice steady and calm, saying that humans were no different in that regard, that threatening a child was the one thing guaranteed to turn peaceful people into something dangerous. The sergeant laughed again, gesturing with 2 of his 4 arms at the small group of colonists facing his armed squad. He asked what these farmers thought they could do against Centauri warriors, what primitive resistance they imagined mounting. Daniel smiled, and that smile made Vexter stop laughing. The human said that the sergeant was about to find out, and then Daniel gave a signal that Greg had been waiting for. Greenhouse went completely dark as Greg killed the power remotely, and chaos erupted in the sudden blackness. Daniel had spent 15 years working in Earth's higher gravity, building strength that the lighter conditions on Kepler 442b made even more effective. He crossed the distance to Vexter in 2 steps, faster than the Centauri expected. His hand found the rifle barrel and twisted it away from Sophie with strength born from desperation and rage. The plasma rifle fired wild, its shot burning through the greenhouse roof. Daniel drove his shoulder into Vexter's midsection, using leverage and momentum to throw the larger alien off balance. Behind him, the other colonists moved with similar speed. Greg tackled one soldier, while Claire, moving with unexpected agility, swept another's legs out from under him, using techniques she had learned in Earth's military years. Agalisa had already pulled the children toward the exit, pushing them through the door and telling them to run. Sophie hesitated, wanting to help her father, but Kyle grabbed her hand and dragged her towards safety. The third Zentari soldier tried to aim at the fleeing children, but Daniel saw the movement. Still grappling with Vexter, he kicked out and caught the soldier's knee. Hearing something crack under the impact, Vexter broke free and swung two fists at Daniel's head. The human ducked under the first, took the second on his shoulder, and responded by driving his elbow into the sergeant's throat with precision that came from years of combat training. The fight lasted less than 30 seconds. A brutal exchange in darkness while Greg worked frantically to keep the Zentari communication network jammed. When the emergency lights flickered on, all four alien soldiers were on the ground. Disarmed and restrained, Daniel stood over Vexter, the sergeant's own plasma rifle pointed at his face. He asked the Zentari if he understood now, if he grasped what happened when you threatened human children. The sergeant glared up at him with hatred and shock. He had assumed humans were weak, had treated them with contempt, had never imagined that these farmers could be warriors when necessary. Greg reported that Zentari reinforcements were already mobilizing, that Commander Thesval had detected the disturbance and was sending troops. Daniel told the other colonists to move the children to the underground shelter they had prepared. To activate all defensive measures, Claire asked what he planned to do with the captured soldiers. Daniel said they would keep Vexter as insurance, but release the others to carry a message back to Thesval, knelt beside the sergeant and spoke clearly so the other Zentari could hear. Tell your commander that we will not leave our home, that pointing weapons at our children was an act of war, that humans may look peaceful, but we remember how to fight. The three soldiers were released and stumbled back toward the Zentari command post. Daniel and the remaining colonists secured Vexter in the greenhouse and then moved to defensive positions throughout the settlement within an hour. Thesval's response came over the colony's communication system. The commander's voice shook with rage as he demanded Daniel surrender immediately, threatened to level the entire settlement from orbit, promised that human resistance would be crushed without mercy. Daniel broadcast his reply on all frequencies, making sure every Zentari soldier and ship could hear. He explained that they had captured one of Thesval's soldiers, that any attack on the colony would result in that soldier's death, that humans were done negotiating. More importantly, Daniel said something that made Thesval pause. He revealed that Greg had been recording everything since the Zentari arrived, including footage of Vexter pointing weapons at human children. And those recordings were set to broadcast to every corner of the galaxy. If anything happened to the colony, the commander tried to dismiss this as an empty threat. Daniel replied that Earth had recently joined the galactic community and was very interested in how other species treated human settlements, that this incident would reach Earth's government regardless of what happened to her. Thesval cut the transmission, and for several hours, an uneasy standoff settled over the colony. The Zentari soldiers maintained their positions, but did not attack, clearly waiting for orders from their commander. Daniel used the time to check on the children in the underground shelter. Sophie ran to him when he climbed down the ladder, asking if he was hurt. If the bad aliens were gone, he held his daughter close, noticing how the other children gathered around as well. Kyle asked if they were going to be okay, if the Zentari would leave them alone. Now Daniel told them the truth. He did not know what would happen next, but the adults were doing everything possible to keep them safe. He saw fear in their young faces, but also trust, faith that their parents and teachers would protect them. Lisa pulled him aside asking what the plan actually was. Daniel admitted he was making it up as he went, trying to buy time for Earth's response, hoping the Zentari would back down rather than escalate. Greg called from the surface, his voice urgent. Zentari dropships were landing around the settlement perimeter, deploying troops in what looked like preparation for an assault. Daniel climbed back up to find 20 armed Zentari forming a ring around the colony. Dexval's voice came over the speakers again, giving a new ultimatum: surrender within 1 hour or face total destruction. The colonists took their positions, armed with whatever weapons they could improvise from farming equipment. Claire set up a field hospital in the community center, while Lisa kept the children calm in their shelter below. Daniel stood in the operations center with Greg, watching the Zentari forces on multiple screens. The engineer asked what Daniel really thought their chances were, and the former soldier replied honestly, "Not good, but better than zero." Greg asked if Daniel regretted choosing to fight. The answer came without hesitation. The moment Vexter pointed that weapon at Sophie, the moment these aliens threatened children, there was no choice to make the hour tick down slowly, each minute feeling like forever. Daniel thought about his daughter's safe below, about the life they had built on this world, about the principle worth fighting for. He opened a channel to all colonists, speaking calmly and clearly. He reminded them why they had come to this planet, what they had sacrificed to build something new, what it meant to stand up for their rights and their children's future. The message was not just for the colonists. Daniel knew the Zentari were listening, knew Dexval would hear every word, wanted the commander to understand what he was truly facing. Humans did not fight because they loved violence. They fought because they loved their children, their homes, their freedom. They fought because surrender meant abandoning everything that made life worth living. When the hour ended and the Zentari began their advance, Daniel gave the signal. The colony's defenses activated, lights blazed to life, and a handful of farmers prepared to show an arrogant alien species what humans became when their cubs were threatened. The Zentari attack began at dawn, with soldiers advancing in formation toward the colony's outer buildings. Dexval had clearly expected the humans to break and run when faced with overwhelming force. But the colonists held their positions. Daniel watched from a fortified position in the equipment warehouse, where Greg had set up multiple camera feeds. The Zentari moved confidently, their plasma rifles ready, their armor gleaming in the morning light. The first surprise came when the leading Zentari squad triggered sensors that Greg had repurposed from the farming network. Modified irrigation systems erupted, spraying not water but a chemical mixture that Claire had created, something that reacted badly with Zentari armor coating. The aliens scrambled back, their formation breaking as smoke rose from their equipment. Before they could regroup, colonists opened fire from concealed positions using weapons that should not have existed on a farming colony. Greg's modifications had transformed agricultural machinery into improvised but effective defense systems. Grain throwers launched metal projectiles with enough force to dent Zentari armor, and mining charges became strategic obstacles that forced the attackers into killing zones. Daniel coordinated the defense through his communicator, directing colonists to fall back when pressed, to hold ground when possible, to make every meter cost the Zentari dearly. He had learned in Earth's military that superior technology meant nothing without superior tactics. The Zentari pushed forward despite casualties, their training and equipment gradually overwhelming the colonist defenders. Daniel knew they could not hold indefinitely, that eventually numbers and firepower would decide the battle in the underground shelter. Sophie sat with the other children while Lisa tried to keep everyone calm. The teacher had set up a makeshift classroom, attempting to maintain normalcy even as explosions echoed from above. But Sophie and the older children understood what was happening. Kyle asked Lisa why the adults were fighting instead of running, and before the teacher could answer, Sophie spoke up. She explained that her father had told her something important. Home was not just a place. It was where you belonged, where you had roots, where your life had meaning. Running away meant losing all of that. Becoming refugees with nowhere to truly call their own. Mia asked if the Zentari would hurt them. Sophie admitted she was scared, but said the adults would protect them, would fight for them, would never let the aliens take their home. Jake, who was good with technology, had been studying the shelter's communication system. He discovered that it connected to the colony's main network, which meant he could access the security cameras if he tried. Lisa told him not to interfere, but Sophie encouraged her friend. She argued that if they could see what was happening, maybe they could help. Maybe they could do something useful instead of just hiding against her better judgment. Lisa allowed Jake to activate the cameras. The children watched in silence as their parents and teachers fought against the Zentari forces. Saw the colonists falling back under pressure. Sophie noticed something on one of the screens. A group of Zentari soldiers was moving around the western perimeter, trying to flank the defenders. She grabbed the communicator that Lisa kept for emergencies and called her father. Daniel answered immediately, asking if everyone was safe. Sophie quickly explained what she saw on the cameras, describing the Zentari movements with surprising accuracy. Greg, listening in, immediately pulled up the corresponding security feed. Sophie was right, and the flanking force would have caught the defenders by surprise if not for her warning. Daniel thanked his daughter and told her to keep watching, to let him know if she saw anything else important. Sophie felt pride surge through her fear, feeling like she was contributing instead of just being protected. The other children gathered around the screens, their young eyes spotting details that adults might miss. Kyle noticed that the Zentari always grouped together when uncertain, creating targets that could be exploited. Mia observed that the aliens seemed uncomfortable in the colony's narrower streets, preferring open areas. Jake tracked which buildings the Zentari had secured and which remained. Contested. Lisa watched her students transform from frightened children into tactical observers, using their intelligence and courage to help defend their home. She set up a system where each child monitored specific camera feeds, reporting anything unusual. Sophie became the primary communicator, relaying information to her father with clarity that belied her 8 years. She told him when Zentari reinforcements arrived, when squads regrouped, when commanders issued orders. The information proved invaluable. Daniel adjusted defensive positions based on what the children reported, avoided ambush, concentrated fire where it would be most effective. Ethexel, watching from his command ship in orbit, could not understand why his forces kept running into unexpected resistance. His tactical advantages should have ended this fight quickly, but the humans kept adapting, kept responding to his movements before they could be executed. What the commander did not know was that 4 children in an underground shelter were undermining his entire strategy. Their fresh perspective and sharp observation gave the defenders an edge that experience alone could not provide. The battle raged through the morning, with the Zentari pushing deeper into the colony despite mounting casualties. Daniel knew they were running out of time, that eventually the defenders would be overwhelmed. Then Sophie noticed something crucial. The Zentari soldiers kept looking toward the community center, where Thexval had established his command post. She realized they were waiting for orders, depending on their commander's coordination. Jake examined communication frequencies that Greg had been jamming intermittently. The young tech enthusiast suggested that instead of blocking Zentari communications completely, they should hijack one channel and broadcast something specific. Lisa asked what he had in mind. Jake explained that Greg had recorded everything since the Zentari arrived, including the footage of Vexter threatening children with weapons. Sophie understood immediately. If they broadcast that footage on Zentari channels, if other aliens in the galaxy saw what was happening, it might change everything. She called her father and explained the plan. Daniel hesitated. knowing it was risky to let the children be involved beyond observation. But Sophie insisted this was important. Greg loved the idea. He worked with Jake through the communicator, walking the boy through the process of accessing the recorded footage and preparing it for transmission within minutes. They had created a broadcast package. Clear video of Zentari soldiers surrounding human children, of Vexter aiming his weapon at Sophie, of the sergeant's threatening words translated into multiple galactic languages. Jake initiated the transmission, sending it out on every frequency the colony could access. The footage spread across local space, reaching ships and stations, being picked up by automated relays that would carry it farther. The effect was immediate and unexpected. Within an hour, vessels began appearing in orbit around Kepler 442b. Not reinforcements for the Zentari, but observers from other species. The Vorquin, who the Zentari claimed to represent, arrived first. Their 3 ships broadcast a message distancing themselves from Dexful's actions, stating that threatening children violated their cultural values. Other species followed, drawn by the broadcast that was now spreading through the galactic network. Daniel watched in amazement as ship after ship took position around the planet and a new voice came over the communication channels, speaking with authority that made even Dexful pause. Ambassador Chixara of the Galactic Council announced her presence, demanding an immediate ceasefire while the situation was investigated. Dexful tried to argue, but his words fell flat against the footage that everyone had now seen. The ambassador ordered all Zentari forces to stand down and withdraw to their ships, pending a formal inquiry. Zentari soldiers, realizing they were being watched by representatives of dozens of species, lowered their weapons. The attack stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the colony battered, but standing. Daniel emerged from his defensive position, exhausted and injured but alive. He walked to the underground shelter and climbed down to find Sophie and the other children still monitoring their screens. His daughter looked up at him with eyes too old for her age. She asked if it was over, if they had won, if the Zentari would leave them alone now. Daniel knelt down and pulled Sophie into a tight embrace. He told her that she and her friends had done something incredible, that their courage and quick thinking had saved the colony when weapons alone could not. The other children gathered around, and Lisa stood back with tears streaming down her face. These kids had faced down an alien invasion not with violence but with truth, broadcasting evidence that turned galactic opinion against their attackers. The Cubs had fought back in their own way, and their battlefield had been information rather than ground. They had proven that courage came in many forms, that even children could make a difference when their home was threatened. The Galactic Council's investigation team arrived 3 days after the ceasefire, and Ambassador Jixara brought with her representatives from 17 different species. The insectoid diplomat established temporary headquarters in the colony's community center. Carefully reviewing every piece of evidence, Daniel stood before the council with Sophie beside him, explaining how the colony had been established legally according to Earth's understanding of interstellar law. He presented settlement documents, planetary surveys, and proof that Kepler 442b had been uninhabited when humans arrived at Thexivol, countered with Vorquin territorial claims filed thousands of years ago, arguing that human ignorance did not negate established galactic precedent. He insisted his forces had shown restraint, that the humans had attacked first. The ambassador asked to see the footage that had been broadcast across local space. The recording played on holographic displays, showing Vexter and his soldiers surrounding the children in the greenhouse. Sophie watched the council members react to the image of a weapon aimed at her chest. Several species made sounds of distress. Others showed physical signs of agitation, and even the more stoic representatives seemed disturbed. Stopped the recording at the moment before Daniel intervened and asked Dexval to explain. The Zentari commander claimed he was simply enforcing the evacuation order, that minimal force had been authorized, the ambassador asked a simple question that cut through all the justifications. Was it normal Centauri procedure to aim loaded weapons at children during peaceful enforcement operations? Thaxival hesitated, knowing that every species represented in this chamber valued their young. He tried to explain that the humans had been violating restrictions, that discipline needed to be maintained. Sophie stepped forward before anyone could stop her. She spoke clearly and calmly, asking the council members if they would feel safe sending their children to learn about plants. If soldiers might point guns at them for being in the wrong place, the chamber fell silent. Chixara looked at this small human child with new respect. Seeing intelligence and courage that belied her years, the ambassador asked Sophie to describe what happened that day. The 8-year-old explained how she and her friends had wanted to water their class project, how the Centauri soldier had scared them, how her father had tried to talk peacefully before the fighting started. Mia, Kyle, and Jake were called to testify as well. Each child told their story honestly, without exaggeration, describing fear and confusion, but also trust that the adults would protect them. The Vorkwan representative spoke up, clarifying that her species had never authorized the Centauri to threaten anyone's children. The territorial claim existed, yes, but it was one of millions filed speculatively across the galaxy. Never seriously pursued. She explained that the Vorkwan had no immediate plans to settle Kepler-442b, that they had filed claims on thousands of worlds as a precaution centuries ago. Finding the planet already occupied by peaceful settlers changed everything. Other council members asked questions about human culture and values. Daniel found himself explaining Earth's protective instincts toward children, the importance humans placed on home and family, the willingness to fight when those things were threatened. Sixer listened carefully, taking notes with several of her 6 limbs. When the testimonies concluded, she announced that the council would deliberate and issue a ruling within 2 days. The waiting period felt longer than the battle had. Colonists repaired damage to buildings, tended to the wounded, and tried to return to normal life while knowing their fate hung in balance. Sophie spent time with the other children, processing what they had experienced. Lisa organized informal counseling sessions, letting the kids talk about their fears and feelings. Jake admitted he had nightmares about the Centauri soldiers. Mia said she kept seeing the red targeting laser on Sophie's chest. Kyle confessed he had been terrified, but did not want to seem scared in front of the younger children. Sophie listened to her friends and shared her own fears. She told them about hiding in the shelter, hearing explosions above, wondering if her father would come back, but she also talked about pride, about feeling useful when she spotted the Centauri flanking maneuver, about knowing that even children could make a difference. The other kids nodded, understanding that courage and fear could exist together. On the second day, Ambassador Chixara called everyone to the community center for the council's decision. Humans and Centauri alike gathered, tension thick in the recycled air. The ambassador began by acknowledging the complexity of the situation. She noted that both sides had legitimate grievances, that cultural misunderstandings had contributed to the conflict, but then her tone hardened as she addressed Commander Thorell directly. She stated that regardless of territorial disputes or enforcement protocols, the action of pointing weapons at children was unconscionable. The footage had been distributed throughout the galactic community, Chixara explained, and the response had been universal condemnation. Dozens of species had contacted the council demanding accountability. The ruling came in 3 parts. First, the human settlement on Kepler-442b was recognized as legitimate under revised protocols that gave weight to actual occupation of unclaimed worlds. Second, Commander Thexval was immediately relieved of duty and would face formal charges of excessive force and threatening juveniles. Sergeant Vexther and his squad would be court-martialed under Centauri military law. Third, The Galactic Council was establishing new protections for all settlements, with specific provisions prohibiting the use of weapons against children during any enforcement action. The law would be known as the Kepler Protocols. Daniel felt relief wash over him. Sophie and the other children cheered, their young voices filling the hall with joy. The Vorquin representative approached Daniel privately, offering formal apologies for the Zenthuri's actions. She explained that her people valued children above almost everything else in their culture, that learning humans felt the same way created immediate kinship. She proposed a trade agreement and mutual defense pact. The Vorquin would help defend the colony if needed, and in return, humans would share agricultural techniques that worked on similar planets. Other species representatives made similar offers. The council members had been impressed not just by human courage, but by the way colonists had fought to protect all their children, not just their own. 3 months passed, and the colony transformed. New families arrived from Earth, drawn by news of the victory and the opportunities available. Sophie became something of a celebrity in galactic circles. News services across dozens of species ran stories about the human child whose testimony had changed diplomatic policy. She handled the attention with remarkable maturity, always crediting her friends and the adults who had protected them. When reporters asked if she had been scared, she answered honestly, terrified, but determined not to let fear win. Daniel watched his daughter grow, seeing someone stronger emerging from the trauma. She had learned that courage meant facing fear, that home was worth defending, that even small voices could speak truth. To power, the greenhouse where the confrontation had begun became a memorial garden. Colonists and aliens alike contributed plants from their homeworlds, creating a living symbol of cooperation. Lisa's school expanded to include alien students whose parents had taken positions on Kepler 442b. Sophie and Kyle helped the newcomers adapt, sharing what they had learned about survival and courage. Greg continued improving the colony's defenses, but now with assistance from Vorquin engineers. The two species found common ground in technological innovation and practical problem-solving. Claire trained several aliens in human emergency medicine, while learning alien techniques in return. The medical exchange benefited everyone, creating better healthcare for the growing population. One evening, Daniel and Sophie stood at the edge of the settlement, watching the sun set over fields that now included crops from 6 different worlds. His daughter asked if he ever regretted choosing to stay and fight. Daniel put his arm around Sophie's shoulders and told her the truth. The decision to stay had never really been a choice, because leaving would have meant abandoning who they were. She asked what he meant, and he explained that humans could survive anywhere, adapt to anything, overcome tremendous obstacles. But what made them human was deciding that some things were worth fighting for: family, home, children, freedom, the right to build a future on your own terms. These were not just abstract concepts, but the foundation of everything that mattered. When the Zenthari threatened those things, particularly when they aimed weapons at children, there had been only one possible response. Sophie understood, young as she was. She had seen what happened when principles met reality, when peaceful people were pushed too far, when parents faced threats against their cubs. The galaxy had learned something important on Kepler 442b. Humans might look soft, might seem peaceful, might prefer farming to fighting, but underneath that civilized exterior lived something fierce and unyielding. They were the honey badgers of the galaxy, and their children were the cubs they would defend with every ounce of strength and determination they possessed. Any species that threatened those cubs would learn what humans became when their young were in danger. Sophie leaned against her father, safe in the knowledge that